The letter had been sitting in the drawer for 11 months, folded with such careful precision that the creases had grown white and soft as old bone, and Bernard Hale had read it so many times alone in the dark that he could recite every word without even striking a match. It was the summer of 1882 in the small cattle town of Redfield, Texas, a place where the wind came off the flatlands with a kind of personal spite, and the dust settled into everything you owned whether you wanted it there or not. Redfield sat at the edge of nowhere and the beginning of something slightly worse, a town of perhaps 400 souls in the dry season and 350 when the weather turned mean and the drifters drifted further. There was a general store, a livery, a church that leaned a little to the east as if it were listening to something the congregation could not hear, a saloon that did reasonable business every night of the week except Sunday, and a post office that doubled as the town's barber shop because the postmaster, a man named Ollie Fitch, had learned to cut hair in his youth and saw no reason to let the skill go to waste. Bernard Hale was 29 years old and ran a modest cattle operation on the eastern edge of the county. He was not a wealthy man, but he was not a poor one either, sitting comfortably in that frustrating middle distance that the frontier produced in great quantities. He was lean from working, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that he kept reasonably trimmed and brown eyes that people sometimes said were thoughtful and sometimes said were just quiet, depending on who was doing the looking. He had come to Redfield 5 years prior from a small town in Tennessee with $30, a strong back, and a determination that had not yet fully converted itself into the specific thing it was determined about. The letter in the drawer had been written to a woman named Clara Biggs, who had been his neighbor's daughter back in Tennessee, and who had grown up to be a woman of uncommon sense and lovely brown hair, and a laugh that Bernard had spent 3 years collecting in his memory like a man collecting coins he would never spend. He had left for Texas before he had the courage to say anything to her, and by the time he had settled enough to feel he had something worth offering a woman, he had written that letter with careful and aching precision. He had told her about the land. He had told her about the sky in the evenings. He had told her that he thought about her with a regularity that embarrassed him. He had told her, in the plain and plainly terrified language of a man who had never said such things out loud, that he would be honored if she would consider him, and that if she wrote back he would take it as permission to write more, and if she kept writing he would find the courage to say the rest. He had never sent it. He had addressed the envelope 3 times. He had walked to Ollie Fitch's post office twice with the letter in his coat pocket. Both times he had purchased some small domestic item, tobacco the first time, a new brass button the second, and walked home with the letter still on his person. The letter had become, in his own private understanding of himself, a piece of evidence that he was a coward in the softest and most specific way a man could be a coward. He did not fear hard work. He did not fear weather or distance or the ordinary hazards of cattle and open country. But he feared the particular vulnerability of being known by another person, of laying his interior life out like goods on a counter and watching someone decide they didn't want to buy. By the late summer of 1882, however, something had shifted in Bernard Hale. His neighbor and only real friend in Redfield, a man named Walt Greer, had married a woman named Dolers the previous spring, and Bernard had watched that marriage unfold at close range like a man watching a fire from the cold side of a window. Walt and Dolers were not a spectacular couple in any outward sense. They quarreled about small things. Walt was stubborn about the direction of the fence lines and Dolers was stubborn about the condition of the kitchen, and they both had opinions about the best way to raise a dog. But there was something in the quality of their ordinary days together that Bernard had not anticipated. There was a kind of warmth in the house at Greer's place that did not exist in his own, and it was not produced by the wood stove. He had ridden home after a Sunday supper at the Greers in July, the sky above the Texas flatlands going through its slow and spectacular death of color, and he had sat on his porch and thought about the letter in the drawer with a feeling that was less like yearning and more like a quiet, practical accounting. He was 29. Clara Biggs, if she had not married, would be 26. 11 months was already a long time. Another 11 months would be unforgivable. He had decided, on that porch in the last of that July light, that he was going to mail the letter. He had given himself until the end of August, because he was the sort of man who needed a deadline to make himself do the things that frightened him, and he had spent August rereading the letter every few evenings and finding it more acceptable each time. And then on the 28th of August, a Wednesday morning that was already hot enough to make the horizon shimmer, he had put on a clean shirt, folded the letter back into its envelope, walked to Ollie Fitch's post office, and mailed it. Ollie had taken the envelope with the casual authority of a man who handled destinies all day and considered them unremarkable, had weighed it and stamped it and set it in the outgoing bag without a word, and Bernard had walked home feeling hollowed out and clean at the same time, the way a man feels after a long illness finally breaks. He told no one. He went home and ate a reasonable supper and went to bed and stared at the ceiling for 3 hours and then slept. And on the Thursday of the following week, which was the 6th day of September, 1882, someone knocked on his door. He was at the back of the property at the time, checking the fence line that ran along the eastern pasture, and he did not hear the knocking. What he heard, eventually, was his hired hand, a young Mexican man named Emilio Vargas who had been working for Bernard for 2 years, and who possessed a talent for appearing precisely when needed, calling out across the field with his hand shading his eyes. "Mr. Hale, there is a woman at your door." Bernard straightened from where he had been examining a post and looked toward the house, which sat perhaps 200 yards distant in the morning haze, and he could see, even at that distance, the shape of someone standing on his porch. The shape was female, definitely, and small, and the person appeared to be carrying a considerable amount of luggage. He walked toward the house with the particular feeling of a man who does not yet know what is happening to him. She was not what he expected. He had expected nothing, having no framework for expectation, but if he had constructed a framework on the way across the field it would not have produced the woman standing on his porch. She was perhaps 5'4", with dark hair pinned up under a hat that had seen better weather, wearing a traveling dress of dark blue that was dusty at the hem and tired at the sleeves, and she was looking at him with eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, the color of creek water in the shade, and her expression was the carefully composed expression of a person who was uncertain about many things but did not intend to show it. "Mr. Bernard Hale," she said. Her voice was steady. She had a quality of self-possession that he found immediately interesting, the kind that is not arrogance but is its close relative, the kind that comes from having been in difficult situations and having managed them. "That's me," he said. "My name is Maude Archer," she said. "I have come from Galveston. I have a letter of introduction from my cousin, Mrs. Dolores Greer, who I believe is your neighbor, and I was told I might be able to arrange temporary lodging with a respectable family in the area while I look for work in Redfield. Mrs. Greer thought you might know of suitable arrangements." Bernard looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the luggage, which consisted of a large trunk, a smaller carpetbag, and a battered hatbox, and which had clearly been transported from town by some means that was no longer present. "How did you get out here?" he asked. "I hired a man with a wagon in town," she said. "He dropped me here and continued on. He mentioned there was a boarding house in town that might suit, but I was also given your name and I thought it polite to call, given the connection to Mrs. Greer." He looked at her again. She looked back at him with those gray-green eyes and that composed expression. "Come in," he said, because it was either that or send her back to town in the heat with her luggage, which he was not going to do. "I'll put coffee on and we can figure out the situation." She picked up the carpetbag with a natural ease that suggested she was accustomed to carrying her own things, and he got the trunk, and they went inside. The kitchen was clean enough. Bernard kept things orderly out of a personal preference for order rather than any domestic ambition, and he put water on and found the coffee, and was aware the entire time of Maude Archer sitting at his kitchen table, looking around the house, with the attentive but polite curiosity of a woman cataloging a situation. She set her hat on the table beside her, and he saw that her hair, where it had escaped its pins, was very dark and had a slight wave to it, and he looked away from this with more deliberateness than was strictly necessary. "How is Dolores?" he asked, measuring coffee. "She seemed very well when I last saw her," Maude said. "That was in April. She came to Galveston for her mother's illness, which ended, I am sorry to say, not happily, and we spent several weeks together during that time. She spoke of Redfield very kindly. She suggested it might be a place where a person could make a new beginning. There was something in the way she said the last part that was not quite neutral, and Bernard, who had learned to hear what was under the words during the quiet years of a solitary life, heard it and filed it away. "You're from Galveston originally?" he asked. "No," she said. "I grew up in Arkansas. I came to Galveston 3 years ago." She said it without elaboration, and he did not press, because it was not his business, and he had been raised by a mother who believed that a person's reasons for being where they were belonged to them until they chose to share. He poured the coffee and brought it to the table and sat across from her, and she wrapped both hands around the cup with the unconscious pleasure of a person who was tired and a little cold from the morning ride, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence was not entirely uncomfortable. "The boarding house in town is Mrs. Hattie Crane's place," Bernard said. "It's decent, clean rooms. She's a reasonable woman. I can take you into town this afternoon if you'd like to look at it." "That would be very kind," Maude said. She paused. "Is there work in Redfield? Honest work? I can keep books, I can teach if the school needs a teacher, I can sew, I can cook for a household. I'm not particular as long as it is honest work." "The school has a teacher," Bernard said. "Fellow named Patterson. He's been there since the spring. But I believe the general store is looking for someone to help with the accounts. Frank Dillard, who runs it, has the business sense God gave a goat, but he's making money in spite of himself, and the books are getting away from him." The corners of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was related to one. "That is a common problem with successful general stores in small towns," she said. "It is," he agreed, and he found that he was also nearly smiling, which was something he did less frequently than he might have liked. He drove her into Redfield that afternoon in his wagon, her luggage in the back, and she sat on the bench beside him with her hat back on against the sun, and looked at the country with a frank and appraising eye. He watched her watching it and tried to see it the way a new person might see it, the flat treeless openness of it, the sky that was simply enormous in a way that either oppressed a person or liberated them depending on what they needed. "It's very flat," she said. "Yes," he said. "I find I don't mind that," she said, as if she had been deciding while she looked. "I grew up in the hills, and I found the hills were very good at holding you in. Flat country has a different quality." "Most people find it lonely," he said. "I find it honest," she said. "You can see what's coming from a long way off." He thought about that for a moment because it was the kind of observation that opened a door rather than closing one, and he wanted to go through the door, which surprised him about himself. They went to Mrs. Crane's boarding house, which was a 2-story frame building on the north side of the main street, painted white with green shutters, and Mrs. Crane, who was a round woman of 50 with a face like a comfortable chair, took one look at Maude Archer and liked her immediately in the way that sensible older women sometimes immediately liked young women of clear-eyed competence. $2 a week, Mrs. Crane said, which includes breakfast and supper. Midday you're on your own. I have 2 rules. No gentlemen callers after 8 in the evening and no drinking in the rooms, and I bend both rules for special occasions so they are not as absolute as I make them sound." "I have no gentlemen callers," Maude said, "and I do not drink. Your rules cost me nothing." Mrs. Crane smiled. "Then we shall get on excellently," she said. Bernard carried the trunk upstairs and left Maude in Mrs. Crane's capable hands, and he drove home thinking about gray-green eyes and the phrase, "flat country is honest," with a persistence that he recognized, because he had felt it before and knew what it meant and was not entirely sure what to do about it, given that he had mailed a letter to another woman less than 2 weeks ago. He was also not sure, by the time he got home, whether he was troubled by this or not. He found that he was not quite. He found that the situation felt, in some oblique and unexamined way, like the world attempting to have a conversation with him that he had not known he needed to have. He fed the horses and did the evening chores and went to bed and lay awake for a long time in the dark, and the letter was no longer in the drawer, and the drawer was empty, and the ceiling was the same ceiling it had always been. The next morning he rode into Redfield and went to see Frank Dillard at the general store. Frank Dillard was 52 years old, red in the face from a lifetime of mild exertion and immoderate eating, and he had the expression of a man perpetually mildly surprised by the complexity of his own circumstances. He was a good man in the specific way that uncomplicated people are good, which is to say he meant well and did no harm and was honest about his limitations, which were mostly intellectual. "I heard you got a new boarder over at Hattie Crane's," Frank said before Bernard could say anything. "Small towns were like that." "Miss Archer," Bernard confirmed. "She mentioned she was looking for work. She says she's good with accounts." Frank looked at him with the focused attention of a man whose interest had been sharply engaged. "Accounts," he repeated. "She says she can do books." Frank's gaze went to the back room of his store, where, Bernard knew, there was a desk buried under a catastrophic archive of receipts, invoices, and what appeared to be several years of mail that Frank had opened, read, and then distributed randomly among other papers like a man playing a very long game of cards. "Well," Frank said, "she'd want to come talk to me about that." Bernard rode back to the boarding house and found Maude in the small front parlor that Mrs. Crane kept for her boarders, writing a letter at the writing desk by the window. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and something in her expression adjusted, not surprise exactly, but a particular kind of attention that he was beginning to recognize as the way she looked when she was interested in something. "Frank Dillard would like to speak with you about the accounts work," he said. "This morning, if you're free." She folded the letter she'd been writing and set down her pen with the decisive movement of a person who had been waiting for a reason to stand up. "Then let us not keep him waiting," she said. Frank hired her within 20 minutes of meeting her, because the state of his books was sufficiently dire that he would have hired anyone who could look at them without immediate despair, and Maude Archer had looked at them with an expression of calm professional assessment that Frank found deeply reassuring. She would come 3 mornings a week to start, at a wage of $4 a week, which was reasonable by the standards of the time and place. She accepted without haggling, which Frank found additionally reassuring, though Bernard, watching from his position near the door where he had stationed himself as unnecessary but companionable moral support, suspected she had considered the figure and found it acceptable rather than not knowing it was fair. He rode her back to the boarding house in the wagon afterward, and she was quietly pleased in the way of a person who has solved an immediate problem and is already thinking about the next one. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and the September morning light on her face, and she said, without looking at him, "Thank you for speaking to Mr. Dillard. You did not have to do that." "I don't do things I don't want to do," he said, which was true and which came out sounding more significant than he had intended. She looked at him then briefly with those gray-green eyes, and he looked back at the road. "Then I am glad you wanted to," she said. He thought about that all the way home and for several hours afterward. Over the following weeks, Redfield continued its ordinary operations, and Maude Archer settled into them with a thoroughness that impressed him. She was at Frank Dillard's 3 mornings a week, and she had found within her first week 2 arithmetic errors in the accounts that had been costing Frank a modest but steady amount for several years. Frank told everyone he met about this with the pride of a man who had discovered a valuable property he had not known he owned. By the end of the second week, Maude was a familiar figure on the main street, and Mrs. Crane told anyone who asked that she was the best boarder she'd had in a decade. Bernard found reasons to be in town on the mornings Maude worked at Dillard's store. He was not unaware that he was doing this. He was a self-aware man about most things, and dishonesty with himself was not one of his vices. So he acknowledged to himself, plainly, that he was manufacturing excuses to be in the vicinity of Maude Archer. He needed supplies from the general store on a more frequent basis than his supplies had previously demanded. He happened to need his horse reshod at the same livery where the farrier worked 2 buildings down from Dillard's. He found himself needing to speak to the postmaster Ollie Fitch about matters that he could not, when he examined them, have characterized as particularly urgent. At Ollie's he asked once, casually, whether there had been any reply from Tennessee, and Ollie had said no, not yet, and Bernard had nodded and left feeling a complex mixture of relief and guilt that he could not entirely separate into its component parts. Maude, for her part, was not unaware of his presence in town. She had not said anything about it, but she was not the sort of person who failed to notice things, and Bernard was beginning to understand that about her. She noticed things. She noticed them and she filed them away, and she waited to see what they meant before she spoke about them, which was a quality he found deeply sympathetic because it was one he recognized. They developed a habit, by the middle of September, of eating their midday meal at the same time when he was in town, at the small eating establishment that a woman named Mrs. Penworthy ran from the front room of her house 2 streets off the main road. Mrs. Penworthy made a beef stew that was the best thing available within 30 miles, and served it with bread and strong tea, and charged 20 cents for the full meal, which was reasonable enough that Bernard did not feel he was spending money ostentatiously to impress anyone. He was spending money to eat lunch with Maude Archer, and they both knew it, and neither of them had said so, and this shared knowledge that neither of them had named sat between them at the table like a friendly third presence that had not yet been introduced. They talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they are building toward something. They talked about the books at Dillard's and what she had found in them. They talked about the cattle market and what he expected the fall prices to be. They talked about Dollar's Greer and how she was settling into life in Redfield, which Maude knew from a different angle than he did. They talked about the town and the people in it, the characters of Redfield who were the sorts of characters all small western towns produced in quantity. The preacher who was kinder than his sermons, the doctor who was more competent than his manners, the saloon keeper who donated quietly to the orphans' fund in the next county and didn't want it known. "This is a town that has a history," Maude said one afternoon, looking down the main street from the steps of Dillard's store. "I can feel it in the layout of the buildings, the way things are placed. Something happened here and the town built up around it." "There was a fire," Bernard said. 1876. Lost most of the original buildings. Everything you see now was built after. "That explains the uniformity," she said. "When a town burns and rebuilds at once, everything looks like it was planned even when it wasn't." "Were you in Galveston for the fire there?" he asked. Galveston had had a significant fire in 1877. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I came after." A pause. "I came after something else entirely." He waited to see if she would say more, and she did not, and he did not press, and they walked down the street together in the afternoon heat, and he thought about the something else entirely, and about the hills of Arkansas she had described as good at holding you in. He invited her to Sunday dinner in the first week of October. He framed it as a general gathering. Himself, the Greers, and Maude and Dollar's, who was a woman of warm and organized affection, produced a meal that would have been notable in a larger city and was genuinely spectacular in Redfield. The Greer house was full of the light and noise of domestic content, and Bernard sat at the table watching Maude talk to dolers with the ease of people who had spent weeks together in a difficult situation and had come out of it liking each other. And he felt a specific kind of happiness that was quiet and dense, the kind that doesn't announce itself but simply settles, the way good soil settles after rain. After dinner, while dolers and Maude were in the kitchen doing the kind of talking that women do in kitchens, Walt Greer took Bernard out to the porch with 2 cups of coffee and gave him the direct look of a man who was a good friend and knew it. "You are considerably less solitary than you were 2 months ago," Walt said. "I am the same degree of solitary I always was," Bernard said. "No," Walt said pleasantly. "You are not. You are in town 3 times a week and you eat lunch at Mrs. Penworthy's on days you used to eat alone by the creek. And before you tell me that is a coincidence, I will tell you that Dolers has already had this conversation with me and I lost it, so I am bringing the results to you as a courtesy." Bernard drank his coffee. "She is a good woman," Walt said, without any particular emphasis, just stating it as a fact the way you state the temperature. "She is," Bernard agreed. "Then the question is what you intend to do about it," Walt said. "I wrote to Clara Biggs," Bernard said. He had not told anyone this. He told Walt now because Walt was the person he told things to. Walt took this in without visible reaction, which was one of the things Bernard appreciated about him. "When?" Walt said. "End of August, just before Maude came. And you haven't heard back?" "No." Walt was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Bernard," he said finally carefully, "writing to a woman you knew 7 years ago and writing to a woman who is currently eating dinner with your neighbors' wives are 2 different situations, and they are not mutually exclusive, and you know that." "I know that," Bernard said. "Do you know that in the way where you believe it, or do you know it in the way where you're using it as a reason to wait for something you should stop waiting for?" Bernard looked out at the flat, darkening land. "I don't know," he said honestly. Walt nodded as if this were the answer he had expected. "Well," he said, "I'd think about it." He did think about it. He thought about it for several days with the focused and somewhat agonized attention that he gave to large decisions. And he thought about what it meant that he had written a letter to a woman after 3 years of not writing it. And a week later, a completely different woman had appeared on his doorstep. And whether the world was trying to tell him something or whether that was the kind of meaning-finding that lonely men did when they needed an excuse to stop being lonely. He thought about Maude Archer's gray-green eyes and the specific quality of her attention when she was interested in something. He thought about the way she had said, "Flat country is honest," on the wagon seat beside him in the first morning of her arrival. And he thought about the way she held her coffee cup with both hands, and the way she talked about books and figures with the genuine pleasure of a person doing work they liked, and the way she had said, "I find I don't mind that," about the flatness of the country, as if she had been deciding in real time and had decided in favor. He thought about Clara Biggs, who had a lovely laugh and brown hair and who lived in Tennessee, and he thought honestly about what the letter had been. He had written it because he was lonely and because loneliness, after long enough, becomes its own kind of pressure, and because Clara had been the last woman he had felt something for, and he had been operating on the assumption that she still was. He thought now, with the specific clarity that comes from contrast, that perhaps she had simply been the last woman he had allowed himself to feel something for, which was not the same thing. He was still thinking when the reply from Tennessee arrived. It came on a Thursday in mid-October, 3 weeks after Maude had arrived in Redfield, and Ollie Fitch handed it to Bernard with the expression of a man who was a postmaster and therefore had no opinions about correspondence, and Bernard took it out to the wagon and sat in it for a moment before opening it. The handwriting on the envelope was not Clara's. He could see that before he even opened it. It was a more formal hand, larger, more practiced. Inside, on a single sheet of paper, a woman named Mrs. Edna Biggs, Clara's mother, had written, in the kind and thoroughly devastating language of a person delivering bad news, that her daughter Clara had married a man named Aldous Pruitt in the spring of 1881, more than a year prior, and had moved with him to Nashville, and was very happily situated. And Mrs. Biggs was sorry the letter had not found anyone to receive it as intended, and she hoped Mr. Hale was well and prospering in Texas. Bernard sat in the wagon with the letter in his hands for a long time. He felt many things, and he let himself feel them. There was something that was grief, but not the grief of losing a person, more the grief of losing a possibility, the grief of a door that you had always thought was there and turns out to have been painted on the wall. There was also, if he was honest, and he always tried to be, something that was simpler and lighter than grief, something that was closer to the feeling of a burden set down. He had sent the letter. He had done the brave thing, 11 months too late, and the answer had been no, and the no had come back not as rejection but as a fact of time that had nothing to do with him. Clara Biggs had not been waiting. Clara Biggs had gotten on with her life, as people reasonably did, and had not needed him to make his mind up and was happy in Nashville. He folded Mrs. Biggs's letter, put it in his coat pocket, picked up the reins and drove to Mrs. Penworthy's eating house. Maude was there, which he had not entirely expected, because it was a Thursday and she did not work at Dillard's on Thursdays. She was sitting at the corner table with a cup of tea and a book, the kind of solitary midday meal that a person eats when they are comfortable with their own company, and she looked up when he came in, and there was that particular adjustment in her expression, that attention settling like light on water. "You look like a man who has received interesting news," she said. He sat down across from her. Mrs. Penworthy materialized with coffee and the unasked question of whether he wanted stew, which he answered with a nod, and then they were alone at the corner table with her book closed on the table between them and the letter in his pocket and the whole complicated interior weather of the past weeks pressing up against the inside of his chest. "I had written a letter," he said, "before you came. Before I'd ever seen you. I'd been holding it for a long time, and I finally sent it the week before you arrived." She looked at him steadily. She did not say anything, and she did not look alarmed, just attentive. "It was to a woman I knew in Tennessee," he said. "A woman I had cared about and never told. I was too late. She married someone else more than a year ago." Maude was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it. He could tell she meant it. She wasn't being polite. "I don't know that sorry is the right response," he said carefully. "I think I have been holding a feeling for a long time that I ought to have examined more closely. I think if I had been honest with myself, I would have known it was more about my own fear than about any particular person." She looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read, but which was not cold and was not distant. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, not challenging, just asking. "Because I think you deserve to know it," he said, "before I say anything else." There was a long moment between them, the kind that has weight, the kind that means something is about to change or has already changed and is only now being acknowledged. "I am in no position to judge a person for not saying what they should have said while they still could," Maude said quietly. She looked down at her teacup, and he saw something move across her face that was not entirely composed, that was beneath the composure, something that lived under the careful surface she maintained. "Do you want to tell me about it?" he asked. Same question she had implicitly asked him. Fair return. She was quiet for longer this time. Outside, the street sounds of Redfield went on their ordinary way, a horse's hooves, a door opening and closing, someone calling to someone across the road. Inside Mrs. Penworthy's front room it was very still. "I had a husband," Maude said at last. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was effortful. He could hear the effort. "In Galveston. His name was Thomas Archer. He died of yellow fever in the summer of 1880. We had been married for 1 year and 3 months. "I'm sorry," Bernard said, and he meant it the way she had meant it, genuinely. "He was a good man," she said. "He deserved more time." She paused. "After he died I stayed in Galveston because I did not know where else to go, and I worked, and I was surviving, which is not the same as living but has its own kind of dignity." She looked up at him. "Dolar's mother passing, that was the thing that made me ask the question again. Where do I want to go? What do I want my life to look like? And Dolers had told me about Redfield, and something about the description of it appealed to me. The flatness, the openness, she almost smiled. The honest horizon. He thought about what she had said in the wagon on her first morning about being able to see what was coming from a long way off, and understood now that it had been about more than the landscape. "How long ago did your husband pass?" he asked, because he wanted the full, honest accounting. "2 years ago in August," she said. "I am not in mourning. I have mourned. I am not going to pretend I carry no grief, because I do, but it is the kind that has settled into part of who I am rather than the kind that prevents living." She looked at him directly. "I am telling you this because you told me yours, and because I think it is only fair." "It is very fair," he said. Mrs. Penworthy brought the stew, and they ate in a comfortable silence that was a different kind of silence than the one before, a warmer kind, a kind that had things settled in it. After he had eaten and paid and they had both stood to leave, he held the door for her and they walked out into the October afternoon, the light coming at that lowered angle that the fall produced, gold and a little melancholy, and he said, "Would you allow me to take you riding on Sunday, just to see the country? I know some places out east of the property that are worth seeing in October." She considered this with the seriousness she gave most things. "I ride passably well," she said. "I am not certain what passable looks like against Texas country." "I'll choose a reasonable horse," he said. "Then yes," she said, "I would like that." He walked to his wagon with the letter from Mrs. Biggs in his pocket, and the empty drawer in his mind, and the October light on everything. And he thought that the world was a strange and specifically generous place sometimes. The Sunday ride was the beginning of what Bernard privately understood to be the courtship, though he did not use that word to himself for some time, because he was a man who needed to arrive at words slowly. They rode east from his property into the open country where the land rolled slightly, just barely, enough to suggest depth without committing to it. And the October grass was the color of old gold, and the sky was an enormous clear blue that was the fall sky's particular gift. He showed her the places he liked. The dry creek bed with the cottonwood trees that had somehow persisted without reliable water through sheer stubbornness. The slight rise to the northeast that gave, in clear weather, a view of perhaps 40 miles, and on exceptional days the suggestion of the Caprock Escarpment in the far distance. The place where he had once, on a cold morning in his first year in Texas, sat on a rock and watched a dawn come up across 100 miles of silence and understood for the first time that he was going to stay. She listened when he talked about these things. Not just politely, but with the quality of genuine attention that means a person is building a picture of your interior life and taking it seriously. She asked questions that were specific, not general, questions that indicated she had heard the specific thing he had said rather than the general category it belonged to. "Do you love this land?" she asked at the dry creek bed where they had dismounted to let the horses rest, leaning against the cottonwood trees in the dappled shade. "Yes," he said. "I didn't expect to. I didn't come here intending to stay. I came here intending to make money and figure out what came next." He looked at the dry creek bed, the pale stones, the still water in the lowest pool. "But there's something about this particular country. It asks a great deal of you and it doesn't pretend otherwise. There's no sentiment to it. It just is what it is." "Honest," she said. "Honest," he agreed and smiled and found she was smiling too, and it was the first time he had smiled at her directly in the full sun, not sideways or at a distance, and she smiled back directly, and the cottonwood leaves moved above them with a sound like a quiet conversation. On the ride home she told him about Arkansas. Not the hills she had mentioned on the first morning, but the specific hills, the Ozarks where she had grown up, the town of Fayetteville, her father who had been a school teacher and her mother who had died when Maude was 12. She talked about the school in Fayetteville and how she had been educated past what most girls were educated to, because her father had seen no reason to stop at the usual point. She talked about moving to Galveston at 23, which had been for a job that her father had found her through a connection, a position keeping accounts for a shipping company, and how she had met Thomas Archer at a church social, and how he had been the first person in a long time who talked to her about books without talking down to her about books. "He sounds like a good man," Bernard said. "He was," she said simply. "He would have liked Texas, I think. He had a quality of not being afraid of big things." He thought about Thomas Archer, dead of yellow fever at some age Bernard did not know, and felt for him the particular respect that the living owe the dead who love the people still among us, a respect and a gratitude combined. October deepened and the nights came earlier and colder, and Bernard found himself in town 4 and 5 times a week, which Emilio Vargas observed without comment but with a small private smile that he was not entirely successful at suppressing. He and Maude fell into a rhythm. They ate lunch together when they were both in town. He drove her back to the boarding house on evenings when she had been at the store late. They attended the same Sunday services at the eastward-leaning church, where the preacher, a man named Reverend Coles, delivered sermons that were kinder than they were fiery, and which usually contained at least one observation of genuine wisdom, and they sometimes compared notes on those observations on the walk from the church to wherever they were going next. He was aware of himself being happy in a way that was new in its quality. He had been content before sometimes, but contentment was different from this. This had a warmth to it, an aliveness, a constant low hum of something he could feel in his chest when he knew he was going to see her. He had been a solitary man by habit and possibly by disposition, but he was beginning to understand that he had been solitary by default as much as by nature, and that the default was answerable to the right circumstances. He took her to meet Walt and Dollars formally, as a deliberate thing rather than a general gathering, and the 4 of them spent a long evening at the Greer place that ended well past 9. With Walt and Bernard on the porch with their coffee and Dollars, and Maude at the kitchen table with their tea, and the sounds of 2 separate easy conversations filling the same house. Walt said nothing about the situation beyond a single look that communicated everything, and which Bernard answered with a slight nod that communicated he was aware. He told her, on a Tuesday in the last week of October, standing outside Dillard's store in the late afternoon while she put on her coat, and the first hint of winter came through in the air, that he was glad she had come to Redfield. "Glad," she said, looking up at him with the amused precision of a woman testing the weight of a word. "It is a considered understatement," he said. She finished buttoning her coat and looked at him with an expression that was warm and a little careful and very honest. "I am glad I came too," she said. "It has not always felt like something I was capable of being glad about, the decision to move on, but I am glad." He walked her back to the boarding house, and at the door he held her hand for a moment and said, "I would like to take you to dinner at Mrs. Penworthy's on Saturday, properly, in the evening, not at noon, which is habit, and not in a group." She looked at him for a moment and then said, "I would like that very much, Bernard." And it was the first time she had said his name, and not Mr. Hale, and he walked home with his hand feeling warm and the evening air cold, and the stars just beginning to appear above Redfield's modest skyline. Saturday came with good weather, clear and cold, and he wore his good shirt and his best coat and rode into town at 5 in the evening, and knocked on Mrs. Crane's door, and Maude came down wearing a dress he had not seen before, dark green, which was the color that the gray-green of her eyes chose to become in contrast, and she had done her hair more carefully than usual, and she was, simply, very beautiful, and he said so. "You are very beautiful," he said, because he had decided that he was going to stop being a person who said less than he meant. She looked momentarily taken aback, not displeased, just surprised, as if she had not expected the directness. Then she said, "Thank you," with a real warmth in it, and took his arm. Mrs. Penworthy had understood from something in the way Bernard had requested the dinner that this was a significant occasion, and she had produced a meal that was lavishly beyond her usual excellent standard, with a roasted chicken and potatoes and a dried apple pie that was in the realm of the genuinely memorable. And she had put a cloth on the table and a lamp with a glass chimney, and then disappeared to the back of the house with a tact that was essentially theatrical. They talked through the whole meal and then sat with their tea and talked more. And the talking was the kind that goes in circles, because neither person wants to stop, rather than the kind that goes in circles, because you have run out of things to say. She told him more about Galveston, the specific streets of it, the smell of the sea which was unlike anything she had ever smelled before she arrived, the way the city existed in a permanent negotiation with the water around it. He told her about Tennessee, the specific quality of the green there, the way the seasons announced themselves more formally than they did on the plains. They talked about books. She had read considerably more than he had, being the daughter of a schoolteacher with a library, but they had overlapping territory, and the books they had both read led to long, productive disagreements about what those books had meant, which were among the most enjoyable conversations Bernard had ever had. "You argue well," she told him, with the specific tone of a compliment that has been considered before being given. "My mother argued well," he said. "I learned from watching her." She felt strongly that being willing to be wrong was more important than being right. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was the wisest person I have known," he said. "She died in 1877, influenza." "My father died in 1879, Maude said. "Heart, very sudden." She paused. "We are both people who have lost things," she said. "I find that is not a sad thing when it is shared exactly. It makes a kind of sense. Like knowing you are not the only person who has been in a dark room," he said. "Yes," she said, and the word was quiet and real and exact. He walked her home in the November-edged night, and at Mrs. Crane's door they stood for a moment in the lamplight from the downstairs window, and he said, "Maude." She looked up at him. "I am not good at this in the conventional way," he said. "I have spent a long time being alone with things that should have been said, and I have decided that I am going to try to be better at the saying." "I know," she said. "I can see that you are trying." "I want to see you every day," he said. "I want to know what you think about every book you read, and what you think of the country, and what you thought of the sermon on Sunday, and whether you agree that Frank Dillard has the business sense God gave a goat, which I believe I said in your presence early on and which I hope did not offend." She was smiling. "I have thought worse about several employers I've had," she said. "I want to take you to see the dawn from the northeast rise," he said. "In early spring when the grass comes back. I want to show you what this country looks like in the spring." She was very still, looking at him. "I am saying," he said more simply, "that I am falling in love with you, and I know it may be too soon to say it, and I am saying it anyway because the alternative is writing it down and not sending it for 11 months, and I have learned my lesson on that score." Her expression had gone through several things while he spoke and arrived somewhere warm and a little undone, the careful composure slightly displaced by something that was more genuine and more vulnerable. Her eyes were bright in the lamplight. "It is not too soon," she said. "I have been watching you watch me for 6 weeks, and I have not discourages it, and I think a woman who does not discourage a thing is communicating something about it." "What is she communicating?" he asked. "That she is feeling something similar," she said, "and that she has been afraid to be the first to say it." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, her fingers curling around his with a naturalness that felt like something that had always been true. "I am also falling in love with you," she said. "Since you have been brave, I will be brave as well." He kissed her hand, which was the thing he knew how to do, the thing that felt right in the moment and the cold night and the lamplight, and she looked at him with an expression that was more unguarded than any she had shown him so far, and then she said good night and went inside. And he walked to his wagon and drove home in the dark with the stars above the flatlands going on forever, and the cold night air on his face, and the feeling in his chest of something that was not the quiet hum anymore, but something louder and fuller and more alive. November brought the cold in earnest, and with it, a kind of domestic intensification in the small community of Redfield, as people moved their socializing indoors, and the natural tendency of a small town toward collective life reasserted itself. There were suppers and gatherings, and the occasional dance at the courthouse, which was large enough to hold a fiddle player and 30 couples on a cleared floor if everyone was willing to be friendly about space. Bernard and Maude attended the November dance together, and it was understood by everyone who saw them that they were attending it together in a specific and significant way, and there was the warm collective approval of a small community that has watched two of its own find each other, which is one of the genuinely sweet things a small town can produce. He could not dance well. He had learned the basic forms but not the ease, and he told her this honestly before they arrived, so that she was not surprised. She danced better than he did, and was patient about it in the way of a person who genuinely doesn't mind, not the way of a person suppressing irritation. He stepped on her foot once and she laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh fully and without reservation, and it was a good laugh, warm and genuine and not decorative, the laugh of a person laughing because something is actually funny rather than because laughing is expected. He thought about it for days afterward. In the second week of November, on a morning when the first hard frost had come, and the ground was white-edged, and the sky was the particular hard blue of cold days, he rode to the Greer place and found Walt in the barn and said, without preamble, "I intend to ask Maude Archer to marry me." Walt set down what he was holding and looked at him with an expression of immense satisfaction. "Good," he said. "I wanted to speak to Dolores as well," Bernard said, "since she is the closest thing to family Maude has in Redfield, and I want to do this correctly." "Dolores will be very pleased," Walt said, with the certainty of a man who has learned to know his wife's opinions on most subjects. "She has been waiting for you to get around to this since approximately the second week of September." "Has she?" Bernard said. "She and Maude have been having conversations that end when you appear," Walt said. "I have not been privy to them, but I have noted the timing." Bernard rode home and thought about what he was going to say and how he was going to say it, and he thought about not writing it down, about saying it out loud, about being a person who said the thing rather than folding it in a drawer. He thought about the ring. His mother had had a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet, which he had kept in a box since her death because he had not known what else to do with it and had never had occasion. He found the box that evening and looked at the ring, and thought that his mother would have found Maude Archer admirable, which was the highest possible commendation. He asked her on a Sunday in the third week of November in the late afternoon, at the dry creek bed with the stubborn cottonwood trees, which had lost their leaves by then, but stood with the specific dignity of trees that have survived difficult seasons. He had asked her to ride with him, and she had come in her riding clothes with her hair in a practical braid, and she had looked at the bare cottonwoods with her attentive, considering look and said, "They look even more stubborn without the leaves." "Yes," he said. "They are a kind of person I respect." She had looked at him and half smiled. He dismounted and she dismounted, and they stood by the lowest pool of the dry creek, which was not entirely dry, holding a remnant of dark water in the cold, and he reached into his coat pocket and felt the ring box and said her name. "Maude." She turned to him. "I am not a man who has always said the right things at the right times," he said. "I have a history of knowing what I felt and failing to communicate it. I intend to change that in any life I have going forward, but I cannot promise I will always succeed. I can promise I will try." She was watching him with great stillness and her full attention. "I can promise you a house that is yours as much as mine, and land that I will work hard to make a good place. I can promise you that I will listen to your opinion on things that matter and most things that don't, and that I will read the books you recommend even when I disagree with them, and that I will try to deserve your trust and your time and your intelligence, all of which are considerable." He took the ring box from his pocket. "I would like very much," he said, "if you would agree to be my wife." She was quiet for a long moment, and in the quiet he could hear the cottonwood branches moving in the cold air, and the distant sound of something crossing the dry grass, and the whole enormous silence of the Texas plains doing what it always did. "Yes," she said, and then she said it again more quietly, as if she was saying it to herself as much as to him. "Yes," and her eyes were bright. And he opened the box and showed her the ring, and she looked at it and said, "It's very beautiful," and he said, "It was my mother's," and she said, "Then it is very precious." And he put it on her finger, and her hand was cold from the November air, and the ring was a good fit, and they stood in the dry creek with the stubborn trees and the cold water and the enormous sky above them. And she reached up and put her hand on his face, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back with a warmth that was entirely unhesitant, and it tasted like cold air. And the end of solitude. The winter of 1882 moved into the winter of 1882's, ending with the specific quality of a time that is happy in a present tense way. A time you know while you are in it is something you will remember. They set a date for the spring, late March, because Maude said she wanted to see the land come back first, wanted to know the place where she was going to live in the time of its renewal, and Bernard thought this was exactly right and said so. He spent November and December making the house ready in the ways that matter, not decorative ways but structural ways, adding a second room to the back of the house with Walt Greer's help through several cold weekends, the two of them working in the chill mornings with their breath-making clouds, and the frame of the new room going up with a satisfying solidity. Emilio helped on Saturdays and proved to be, additionally, a skilled carpenter, which he had not mentioned because he was a person who did not advertise himself. Maude continued working at Dillard's and went on living at Mrs. Crane's, which was correct and expected, and Mrs. Crane was warmly pleased about the engagement in the way of a woman who had known such things were coming, and took a quiet proprietary satisfaction in the outcome. She gave Maude, as an engagement gift, a quilt of exceptional quality that she had made herself over the preceding years, and which she described only as having been made for a future occasion, and Maude received it with genuine feeling, and could not entirely keep the feeling from her face, which Mrs. Crane appeared to find satisfying. There was a small celebration at the Greer place in early December, with Walt and Dolers and Maude and Bernard and Mrs. Crane and Ollie Fitch, who had been included because he was a genial man, and because Bernard felt he had, in a technical sense, played a role in the story by accepting the mailed letter. And the evening was warm and full of laughter, and Dolers made a cake that was legitimately remarkable. At some point in the evening, Bernard found himself standing with Dolers at the edge of the kitchen while the others were in the front room, and Dolers, who was a woman of warm and organized affection, but also of considerable directness when the situation merited it, looked at him with an expression that was both happy and a little fierce. "Take care of her," Dolers said. Not as a threat but as a statement of what was expected, what was due. "I intend to," he said. "She has had a hard time of it," Dolers said. "Not in the way that makes a person brittle, she is not brittle, you have seen that, but in the way that makes a person careful. She has been careful for a long time." She paused. "She needs someone who will be worth the risk of not being careful. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," he said. "Good," Dolers said, and then went back to her cake and her party with the efficiency of a woman who has said what needed saying and has moved on. January was cold, and February was colder, and they spent the cold months in the domestic intimacy that an engagement in a small town produces, which is to say they were in each other's company often and comfortably and increasingly naturally. He showed her the books he had read, and she showed him hers. She helped him with the accounts for the cattle operation, which were not in the state of Frank Dillard's books but were more haphazard than they needed to be, and she brought them into order with the pleasure of a person untangling something that wants to be tidy. He read what she asked him to read, and they argued about it with the comfortable enjoyment of two people who have established that arguing about books is one of their preferred activities. On cold evenings at the Greer place, or at Mrs. Penworthy's, or sometimes at the house, he was making ready for her. She would tell him more about her life in increments, the way people tell their full stories over time rather than all at once. She told him about Thomas Archer in small pieces, not with any particular sorrow, but with the honesty of a person integrating a large experience into their continuous life. He listened with the same quality of listening she had always given him, the building a picture quality, the taking it seriously quality. He asked questions that were specific. He did not try to resolve things she wasn't asking to be resolved. "You never try to make it better," she said once. "Is that right?" he asked. "I mean it as a compliment," she said. "Most people, when you tell them something sad, try to find the silver lining immediately or change the subject because they're uncomfortable. You just let it be sad when it's sad. It seems most useful," he said. "Things that are sad are sad. You don't improve them by putting a different face on them." She looked at him with that warm, unguarded look that she had started giving him more frequently as the months passed. "It is very useful," she said, "and rare." He thought about that for a long time. He thought about how much of love was simply the willingness to be present with the full truth of another person, the good and the sad and the complicated, and not to flinch from any of it. March came in with a late cold snap, and then in the third week, with the precise suddenness that the Texas spring produced, the land came back. The dry grass went green overnight, or so it seemed, and the sky went from the hard blue of winter to the softer, deeper blue of the spring, and Bernard took Maude to the northeast rise on the first Sunday of the spring weather, the 22nd day of March, which was also 6 days before their wedding. They rode in the early morning, before the town was entirely awake, and reached the rise as the sun came fully up, and the light went across 40 miles of greening land, and the suggestion of distant formations, and the enormous sky overhead doing the thing it did in spring, which was like watching a room fill with light. She stood beside him with her hand in his and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "This is what you meant." "Yes," he said, "when you said you sat on a rock and watched the dawn and understood you were going to stay." "Yes, I understand now," she said. She stopped. "I do not have words sufficient for it," she said. "It is very large." "Yes," he said. "I would like to stay," she said. And then she looked at him, and the sentence was carrying more than one meaning, and he could see both meanings in her face, the literal one about the place and the other one about him and the life they were going to make. And he tightened his hand around hers, and they stood in the spring morning with the country going on forever in front of them. They were married on the 28th of March, 1883. Reverend Coles performed the ceremony in the eastward-leaning church with its particular quality of listening, and the congregation consisted of Walt and Dolores Greer, Mrs. Hattie Crane, Frank Dillard and his wife Portia, Emilio Vargas, who stood in the back with his hat in his hands and a wide and genuine smile, Ollie Fitch, and a considerable number of the townspeople of Redfield who came, because small towns are curious about weddings, and Maude Archer had, in 6 months, made herself known and liked in Redfield in the particular way of a person who earns their place. Maude wore a dress of cream-colored wool, which was what was practical for late March in Texas, with a lace collar that Mrs. Crane had contributed, and pinned herself with the careful hands of a woman who had done this for other brides. She had her dark hair up and a small bunch of early wildflowers that Emilio had somehow located in the just beginning spring, which he gave her in the morning with the gravity of a young man who takes his contributions to important occasions seriously, and she accepted them with a warmth that made Emilio's smile even wider. Bernard stood at the front of the church in his good coat and his cleanest boots and watched Maude walk toward him, and thought that he had spent a long time writing things down that he ought to have said out loud, and that from here forward he was going to try to say the things out loud when they needed saying, and that the thing that needed saying right now was something that he hoped the entire church could see on his face whether he said it or not. She arrived beside him and looked up at him, and her gray-green eyes were bright, and there was something in her expression that he had never seen before and that he understood was for him specifically. A particular openness, a particular choice to be fully present without protection. And he thought that Dolores had been right about what she needed, and he intended with everything he had to be worth the risk. Reverend Coles said the words, and they said their words, and he put the ring on her finger, the garnet ring, already hers from the fall, and she put on his finger the plain gold band she had bought from the jeweler in Abilene who came through Redfield in January, and they were married, and the small congregation of Redfield made the sounds that small congregations make, which are a specific combination of happiness and relief that has been honed over centuries and always sounds exactly right. There was a wedding dinner at the Greer place that afternoon that lasted until well past dark and produced several memorable speeches, including one by Walt Greer that managed to be both extremely funny and unexpectedly moving, and one by Maude herself, which she had not been expected to give, which surprised everyone including Bernard, and which said in careful and precise language that she had come to Redfield looking for a new beginning and had found one, and that the specific nature of it was beyond anything she had known to want, and that she was grateful in a way that did not have adequate expression, and that she intended to spend the rest of her time here trying to be worthy of it. Bernard did not give a speech. He looked at her from across the table and she looked at him, and the look said everything that a speech would have said, and it was better. They went home in the evening in the wagon with the stars out, and the spring air warm enough that she did not need her coat, and she sat beside him on the bench with her shoulder against his shoulder the whole way home, and they went inside the house that was hers as much as his, and the new room in the back was furnished and ready, and the garnet ring was on her hand, and Bernard Hale, who had been alone for a long time in the particular way of a person who has not allowed himself not to be, was not alone. The spring went well. The cattle were healthy and the prices were decent, and the new room in the back was fully inhabited by the end of April with the quality of genuine habitation that only happens when a person who intends to stay has settled their things with intention. Maude continued at Dillard's 3 mornings a week, because it was work she liked, and because she was good at it, and because Frank Dillard, whose business had measurably improved in the months she had been managing his accounts, would have been bereft without her. She made changes to the house in small ways that accumulated into something large. She was not a woman who changed things dramatically or without asking, but she had a sense for what a space needed, and the things she added or adjusted were always the right things. A curtain here that changed the light, a rug that made the floor warmer underfoot, books on the shelf that had been empty since he had moved in, a kitchen that smelled increasingly like a kitchen that was being used for more than the functional minimum. She had, it turned out, an exceptional capacity for hospitality. Walt and Dolores came to supper at their house and marveled at what she had made from the same pantry that had previously produced bachelor meals of reasonable but uninspired quality. Mrs. Crane came once a month and was always treated as a person of significance, which she was, and which she received with the pleasure of a woman who had been performing significance for others for decades and was glad to have it returned. Emilio Vargas was invited to the house for Christmas dinner in 1883, and this became a permanent tradition, partly because he was genuinely a member of the family that the ranch constituted and partly because Maude had learned within 2 months of arriving that he had no family within a day's travel, and that this was a gap that could be addressed without difficulty. Emilio, who was 22 and had come to Texas from Chihuahua at 17, and built his American life with the combination of skill and will that the border country produced in its best people, received this inclusion with a gravity and gratitude that he expressed mainly through working harder than anyone could reasonably expect, and being reliably honest about everything, which were the forms of gratitude he knew how to give, and which Bernard found more valuable than any formal expression. They talked sometimes in the evenings about the injustices of the land. Bernard had seen enough of the Texas frontier to know that the story of the West was not a simple story of progress, that the land they were on had been other people's land first, and that the displacement was a fact that sat uncomfortable under the romance of the open country. Maude was educated about these things, her father having been a schoolteacher with strong opinions about what the full truth of history required, and she did not pretend that beauty and injustice could not exist in the same place. Emilio had his own experience of the border, of the ways the land had changed hands and the ways Mexican families had been pressed at the edges of what was supposed to be their own territory, and Bernard listened to this with the attention of a man who knew he was occupying a particular position and wanted to understand it honestly. He could not resolve it. No one could resolve it in a parlor conversation. But the refusal to look away from it felt like a form of respect, and he was glad to have a wife who agreed. By the summer of 1883, Maude was expecting their first child, and she told Bernard on a morning in late June when she had been certain enough for several weeks to say it, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and the early light on the curtain she had hung in April. He had known something was coming from the way she had looked at him when he came in for breakfast. He sat down across from her and she told him, and he looked at her for a long moment with an expression he was not trying to control, and then he got up and came around the table and took her face in his hands carefully, the way you hold something precious that you are still learning the weight of, and said, "Maude," which was all he said, but she received it as if it were a paragraph, because by then she knew how to read the full sentence from the single word. He was afraid, which he told her honestly when she asked. He told her that the fear was not about wanting the child but about the wanting itself, about the specific terror of loving something more than you can protect it. She said she understood that fear from the inside and that it did not go away, but that you learned to hold it alongside the love rather than in front of it, which was, he thought, possibly the wisest thing he had ever heard, and he said so. And she looked pleased in the way she looked pleased, which was quiet and real. The pregnancy was healthy, and she continued most of her activities with the practicality of a woman who saw no reason to treat a normal event as an incapacity. She stopped riding in August when it became uncomfortable and took instead to walking in the mornings, long walks that she described as necessary for thinking, and often he walked with her when the morning work allowed, and the walks became their best conversations, the ones that ran underneath the daily business and got at the deeper questions. They talked about what they wanted for the life they were making. Not material things, though those had their place, but the shape of it. The kind of people they wanted to be inside the marriage, the kind of parents. He said that he wanted to be a father who said the things that needed saying rather than leaving them unsaid until it was too late, which was the failure he had spent years working against in himself. She said she wanted to be a mother who raised a child to be curious, to ask questions, to be honest about what they did not know, which she traced to her own father and the schoolroom he had made a place of genuine inquiry. They talked about what they had come from, the separate losses and distances, and they talked about what it meant that they had ended up in this specific place in this specific fall of years. And she said once that she thought there was no predestination in it, that she did not believe in the kind of fate that preordained specific people for each other, but that she believed in the kind of fate that created the conditions in which two specific people, making specific choices, could find each other. And that the finding was still the thing you did yourself, it was still yours. He thought about the letter in the drawer. He thought about the 11 months it had sat there, and the morning he had finally walked to Ollie Fitch's post office in a clean shirt, and the week that had followed, and the knock on his door on a September morning in 1882. He did not think it was predestination either, but he thought about it with gratitude, the specific gratitude for the accumulation of choices that had led to specific good, gratitude for having finally done the thing he was afraid to do, and for what the doing had made possible. He told her about it once, in full, the whole 11 months of the letter in the drawer. He had sketched it before, but he told her the full version now, On a December evening with the fire going and her in the chair by the fire in the late months of her pregnancy, knitting something small and complicated. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when he was finished she looked at him over the knitting with her gray-green eyes and said, "The week you mailed it." "The week I mailed it," he said. "That is the most perfectly terrible timing," she said, and began to laugh, and he began to laugh too, and the fire was warm and the laugh was her real laugh, the one he had been collecting since the November dance, and the house was full of the life they had made and the life that was coming. Their son was born on the 7th of February, 1884. It was a hard labor, and Bernard spent the better part of 2 days in a state of controlled terror that he managed by doing every physical task the doctor and midwife asked of him, and several they had not. The doctor was a man named Chambers, competent if irritable, and the midwife was a woman from the east side of town named Mrs. Lucero, who had delivered more children than anyone in Redfield, and had the calm authority of a person who has been the most important person in the room on many occasions. When it was over, and Maude was pale and exhausted and entirely intact, and the baby was in her arms making the sounds that new babies make, which are small and ancient and impossible to prepare for no matter how much you think you have, Bernard sat beside the bed and looked at the two of them for a long time without speaking. Maude was looking at the baby with an expression he had never seen on her face before, that particular radical love that a new mother has, the love that is also slightly astonished by itself, and she looked up at him and said, "He has your eyes." He looked at his son's face, the impossible small particularity of it, and felt the thing he had tried to describe before, the fear and the love occupying the same space, just as she had said they would, just as she had been right about, and he reached out and put his hand over hers and said, "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names but reached no conclusion. She had said she wanted to wait until she saw the child, and he had agreed, and now they looked at the person between them who was 8 hours old and entirely himself. "Nathaniel," she said, "for my father." "Nathaniel Hale," he said, testing it. "Nathaniel Thomas Hale," she said, and her voice was steady on the Thomas. He understood and was glad. "Nathaniel Thomas Hale," he said. "That's a good name for a person." Nathaniel Thomas Hale was a good-tempered child, which was fortunate and curious, which was inevitable given his parents, and stubborn, which should have surprised no one. He was walking by 10 months and talking by 14, not long sentences but insistent syllables directed at everything in his environment, interrogating the world with the focused attention of a small person who finds all of it of equal and urgent interest. Bernard, who had been afraid of the loving, found that the loving was entirely unlike what the fear had prepared him for. The fear had been about loss. The love was not primarily about loss at all. It was primarily about presence, about the specific privilege of being in the same room as this particular person, as he learned what things were. He carried Nathaniel on his shoulders at an age when children are usually still being carried lower down, and walked him around the property explaining things in the reasonable tones of an adult who knows the information is not being retained, but who believes firmly in the principle of talking to a child as if the information matters. Maude watched this with the expression she had for things that made her deeply happy, which was warm and slightly inward, as if she were tucking it away somewhere safe. The next 2 years brought the ordinary, extraordinary business of a life. The cattle operation expanded modestly. Emilio Vargas was given a formal partnership in the operation because he had earned it by every measure Bernard knew how to apply, and because doing the right thing was, his mother had taught him, better done sooner than later. Emilio, who had not expected this, received the news with a silence that lasted several seconds and then said, "Mr. Hale, and stopped, and Bernard said, "You've earned it. I should have done it sooner." Emilio said very quietly, "Thank you," and that was enough. Maude found new uses for her capacities as Redfield grew. The town was expanding in the way of Texas towns in the 1880s, tentative but real, new families coming in, new business being established, and her skill with accounts was increasingly useful in ways that went beyond Dillard's general store. By 1885, she was keeping the books for 3 establishments in town and had, in a practical sense, become the financial intelligence of a significant portion of Redfield's commercial life. She did not advertise this, but she was satisfied by it in the quiet and genuine way of a person doing work that uses what they actually have. She brought this same intelligence to bear on the school question, which arose in 1885 when Patterson, the teacher, left Redfield for a position in a larger town. The school board, which was a committee of 4 men who knew they needed a teacher and had approximately no plan for getting one, held a meeting that Maude attended, having heard about it from Frank Dillard's wife Portia, and made a proposal that was so well organized and practically conceived that the school board accepted it before they had fully understood what they were agreeing to, which was that she would help them recruit a new teacher through a network of educational contacts she had developed in Galveston, and that in the interim she would teach 2 mornings a week to keep the school running. She taught until the new teacher arrived in October, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Calloway, who was 23 and extremely capable, and who Maude took under her wing in the specific way that a slightly older woman takes a younger one when the younger one has come somewhere new alone and needs someone to be on her side. Nathaniel turned 2 in February of 1886, and Maude told Bernard in March that they were expecting again. This time Bernard was less afraid, which was not because the stakes were lower, but because he had learned, over 2 years of practice, that he was more capable of holding the love and the fear together than he had initially believed himself to be. He was still afraid. He was a father, and fear was now a permanent resident of his interior life in the way it is for anyone who loves something they cannot entirely protect. But the fear was not the largest thing. Their daughter was born in November of 1886, and she was named Eleanor Dolores Hale, the Eleanor for no specific person, but because it was a name they both liked the weight of, and the Dolores for reasons that required no explanation. Dolores Greer wept when she heard the name, at Christmas dinner, which was by then a large and established event at the Hale house, because the Greer house was smaller, and the Hale house had the new room in the back, and the kitchen Maude had organized into a space of considerable capacity. Dolores wept, and Walt put his arm around her and looked at Bernard and Maude with an expression that was entirely content. And Bernard thought about the Sunday supper at the Greer's place years ago, the warmth in the house that he had watched from the cold side of the window, and understood that he was now inside the warmth, and that it was entirely as good as it had looked from outside. Eleanor Dolores Hale was a different person than her brother from the first month of her life, where Nathaniel was gregarious and loud and interrogated the world at volume. Eleanor was observant and quiet, and gathered information before making pronouncements, which she then made with a precision that startled people who were not prepared for it. She had Maude's gray-green eyes and Bernard's tendency toward long silences that were not unfriendly but were very much their own. Nathaniel adored her unconditionally from approximately the 2nd week of her life, which he demonstrated by bringing her things, initially inappropriate things like rocks and pieces of fence he had found interesting, and later more appropriate things like blankets and the specific wooden horse that was his most prized possession, which he placed in her reach at an age when she could not reach for anything. But the intention was clear. The years accumulated with the specific quality of years that are being lived rather than waded through. Redfield grew. New people came. The railroad reached a point close enough to Redfield in 1887 that the cattle operation changed in character, with easier access to markets, and this was good for the business in ways that required adjustment but that were fundamentally positive. Bernard navigated these changes with the steady pragmatism that had always been his professional quality, and with Maude's account books, which were immaculate, keeping the full picture clear. He still walked. He still took the mornings, when they allowed it, to ride the eastern edge of the property or stand at the slight rise and watch the country. Maude sometimes joined him and sometimes did not. But when she did, she stood beside him in the same posture she had had on their second morning together, looking at the country with a frank and appraising eye, and then saying the exact right thing about it. One morning in the spring of 1888, standing at the northeast rise in the early light with the country going green again in its annual extravagance, she said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "What?" he said. "The letter," she said. "The letter you wrote and didn't send. The 11 months it sat in the drawer." She was looking at the horizon. "I think about what would have happened if you hadn't sent it when you did. If you'd waited another month or another year, whether I would have come anyway." "I think you would have come anyway," he said. "Dollars would have told you about Redfield." "Probably," she said. "But would you have had any reason to walk up to me on your porch and invite me in for coffee? You had nothing to lose by then. You'd already done your brave thing. You'd already sent the letter." He thought about this. "You think the sending of the letter made the difference," he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that doing the brave thing you have been afraid to do changes you. Not in the way that the outcome does, but in itself. You sent that letter and the answer was no, and you survived the no, and something in you was different after that. More open maybe, less defended." He thought about the porch, the morning of her arrival, the shape of her standing with her luggage in the September heat, and the thing that had made him say, "Come in," without hesitation, and he thought she was probably right. "I was less defended," he said. "And I could see that," she said, "from the first day. That you were a person who had recently decided to stop defending himself so thoroughly." He looked at her, at the profile of her face in the spring morning light, the gray-green eyes on the horizon, the dark hair with its silver threads now at the temples, which had appeared in the last year and which he found purely beautiful. "I'm very glad I sent it," he said. "So am I," she said, "even though it wasn't about you." "Especially because it wasn't about me," she said. "It was about you deciding to live the way you wanted to live. The rest was," she smiled, "the rest was the world meeting you there." He took her hand and they stood in the spring morning with the country spreading out 40 miles in front of them and the life they had made solid and warm behind them. And he thought about all the mornings he had sat in this country alone and watched the light come up over nothing and called it enough. And he thought about how wrong he had been, how completely and fortunately wrong. He thought about the empty drawer. He thought about Ollie Fitch accepting the letter with the bored authority of a man for whom destinies were ordinary. He thought about the wagon bench on a September morning and the gray-green eyes of a woman looking at the flatlands with honest curiosity and deciding she did not mind them. He thought about saying things out loud, about how the bravest and most necessary thing a person could do was to stop folding their interior life into careful creases and walking past the post office with it burning in their pocket, and start saying the real thing, simply and directly, to the specific person who needed to hear it. "I love you," he said, which was a thing he said often but which never became habitual, which always had its full weight. "I love you, and I am grateful for every specific thing that led to you being on my porch that morning." She turned to look at him with that expression she had, the warm, unguarded one that was still, after 5 years, the most valuable thing he had ever been given. "I love you," she said, "and I am grateful for every specific thing that put me on that porch, including the difficulties, because the difficulties brought me here." He kissed her in the spring morning at the northeast rise with the enormous, honest country going on forever around them. And it was the same kiss it had always been, which is to say it was entirely itself, specific and real and belonging to no one else. And it was also a continuous and ongoing thing, as love is when it is working correctly. As it had been from the cottonwood trees in November and the garnet ring and the letter finally mailed and the door opened and the life chosen and the empty drawer and the full house and the children sleeping and the years ahead like the Texas spring, coming back every time, green and persistent and honest. The summer of 1888 moved with the warmth that good summers have, unhurried and full of light. Nathaniel was 4 and Alina was a year and a half, and the house was never quiet, and Bernard found that He did not miss quiet the way he had once thought he needed it. He found that the specific noise of his specific children was not noise in the way that absence of peace is noise, but was instead a kind of music that he had not known existed and could not now imagine doing without. Walt and Dolores Greer had 2 children of their own by then, a boy named Henry and a girl named Frances, and the children played together on summer afternoons with the chaotic democratic energy of young children who have not yet learned to categorize the world. And the 2 families sat on porches and watched this with the contentment of people who have made something good out of the available materials. On a Sunday in August, at the eastward-leaning church where Reverend Coles was still preaching his kinder-than-expected sermons, Bernard sat in the pew with a leaner on his lap and Nathaniel wedged against his side with the fidgeting energy of a 4-year-old instructed to be still, and Maude on his other side, and he looked at the light coming through the windows, the high summer Texas light that was like being inside gold, and he thought, with a plainness and a fullness that needed no elaboration, that this was the life he had wanted and that he had it. He reached out without looking and took Maude's hand, and she took his without looking, and they sat in the gold light of the summer Sunday with their children between them and around them, and Reverend Coles saying something about the nature of grace that was genuinely true. And Bernard thought that the man was right, that grace was the right word for it, for the way the good things came not as reward but as gift, not as deserved but as given. Not to the careful and defended person, but to the one who had finally opened the drawer and done the terrifying, ordinary, courageous thing of saying what he meant. Alina reached up and grabbed his finger with her small, complete hand, the way babies do, with absolute certainty and no explanation. And he looked down at her, and she looked up at him with her mother's gray-green eyes, and he thought that this was what he had been heading toward all along. Through all the solitary years and the written things and the unsent things and the flat country that asked a great deal without pretending otherwise, and that arriving had been exactly as good as arriving ought to be. Maude leaned her shoulder against his, and he could feel her warmth and the particular quality of her presence that he would know anywhere now, in any light, in any season. And he thought about the letter in the drawer and the letter in the mail and the knock on the door, and the whole long, irreversible, beautiful chain of it. And he was glad, specifically and entirely glad, in the way of a man who has nothing left unsaid. The church filled with the sound of Reverend Coles reading from the book of Ruth, the old words about where you go I will go and where you lodge I will lodge. And outside the summer went on, and the land was flat and honest in the heat, and the horizon was wide and clear and showed you everything that was coming from a long way off, and it was good, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.